So to introduce our fabulous panel, we have Philip Lassman, Vice President and Head of Development Northern Europe at Accor. Alison Hargreaves, Senior Portfolio Manager, Archer Hotel Capital. Jacob Raisin, Senior Vice President at Transactions from Pandox. And Tony Nutkins, Head of Hotels and Healthcare at Coots. So I thought we'd just go straight into questions, because I know everyone's anxious to get off to lunch shortly. Today we're talking obviously about the rise of the hotel sector, and let's start off with a nice easy question. So Philip, what are the hottest segments and geographies right now for acquisitions and development? What are you worried about most?
Well, I'll take the short answer. Not too worried about the benefits of being a global brand is we're everywhere, and when events happen in the world, there's always a bigger part of the world where there's nothing going on. So actually, 2024 was a great year for growth and developments, and in the Europe region, we had a phenomenal success, had a record year for development, we had a record year for openings. So where is that coming in within Europe? Europe for us is very much split in terms of where we see a lot of activity going into Eastern Europe. Poland's busy for us, Romania is very busy for us, the CIS countries are very busy for us. Georgia, which was mentioned earlier, has been extremely busy for us. And on the opening side, again, that's mirroring it. And we're seeing a lot of the restrictions that we're having in Western Europe when it comes to the lack of new builds. We don't see those problems in Eastern Europe, and so we're getting new builds and conversions away there, and we're focusing a lot on the conversions here. So ultimately, it's been a very, very strong year for growth, and we continue to grow, and a good mix of all the brands, especially the conversion brands on the closer to home in the UK.
Thank you. And Jake, you've been diversifying a little bit, haven't you?
Yeah. So we acquired 3 Residence Inn in the sort of apart hotels segment, and that's sort of strategy we've been sort of pursuing since post-COVID. We like this segment because of the operational flexibility in the operating model. We like where the consumer behavior. We have Airbnb, service apartments, and hotels, and somewhere in the middle, and we're seeing great sort of growth in demand that outweighs supply. And after starting to learn a little bit more of the operator landscape, we're seeing operators that are willing to sign leases. So we just signed a deal with Numa in Brussels that we're also interested in looking at operating model and how we can sort of team up with them. So it's an active decision, and I think we're going to continue pursuing opportunities in this segment.
Great, thank you. And Alison, I think, would I be right in saying that Archer is perhaps a little more opportunistic in its approach?
That's correct. I think we've moved away from having target markets as such and target submarkets, or trying to infill perhaps where we have gaps in our portfolio, and we're invested in the upscale luxury segments, a bit of lifestyle. So nod back to the previous panel with our 2 Hoxtons in London. So we tend to look, we're looking on a deal by deal basis, more opportunistically than focused on specific markets.
Great, thank you. So turning to headwinds, because we promised to talk a little bit about headwinds, inflation. So I've seen a number of economists talking about inflation recently, some talking about the rate at which inflation may change. Have hotels coped with this better than other real estate asset classes, thanks to their ability to set prices every day? And at the same time, are you also at the mercy of other rises in costs? So, for example, labour costs and other costs. So, Tony.
Okay. So inflation has been a key impact on the sector, not just the sector, but across the economy. And as Andrew was up, The Economist opened up with earlier this morning, It's driven costs quite significantly, and it's caused a lot of pressure. I think what we've seen in the hotel sector, though, is its ability to flex rate has been very unique, and it's able to react to those increases in costs quite quickly and changes in demand as well. So I see the sector as a very reactive sector that's been able to respond very quickly and overcome some of these increases to cost quite quickly and effectively. I think the challenge, though, and the question is how the sector is able to respond to these rising costs that are coming through. So we will look at the national living wage and, most importantly, national insurance, which is due to come up, and it's how effectively can these costs be covered by increases to ADR. We're working with a number of clients at Coutts with looking at repositioning assets, perhaps, trying to look at maximising revenue where we can, look at reducing costs with implementation of new technologies and streamlining costs where possible. So I think the asset class has worked very well. It's just there's lots of pressure coming through, but overall we're very positive with the sector, and I think the resilience that the operators have shown in the market and the speed of being able to adapt has been very strong.
I mean, certainly wages costs are things which everybody is expecting. There's also a lot of employment-related costs which are difficult currently to quantify, but in time they're going to be become clear, I think. Alison, I think from your perspective, rates seem a bit more elastic at the top of the market.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously inflation's a factor, but at the top end we were able to push rates. ADR is really robust, and we're sort of invested in key city centre markets in Western Europe, so quite reliant on US demand coming in. So we saw those rates push, which is great. Obviously, labour is already a major issue. I think we probably all went through our budget process and had budget V1, and then the budget drops, and then we move on to budget version 2, and certainly across all of our jurisdictions, not just pressure on labor costs, but new regulation coming in has been mentioned, coupling that with higher cost of living. And I think we realize in our industry we have to start to pay people a better wage to retain the right, to attract the right people and retain them. In some of our hotels in the past, they've really prided themselves on not being minimum wage employers. But with that squeeze, they're still not minimum wage employers, but that sort of, that delta is being squeezed a bit. So it's a real challenge, and there's certainly no downward pressure we're seeing anywhere on labor costs, so it's tough.
And I think Andrew and, was it Ufi or somebody else talked just before us about getting people into the industry and keeping them into the industry, and then somebody may start in housekeeping, but how do you move them then into other areas? Because this is one of the great industries where you have people who can progress significantly throughout the business without necessarily having a very formal high level of education, but they have that education on the job, as it were, and perhaps keeping people in the business may involve paying to attract the right people to begin with. So looking at tailwinds, how have falling debt costs and development funding been seen as a sort of a tailwind?
Everyone looking at me on that one now.
Yeah.
Falling interest rates, it's positive. They're clearly welcomed, without doubt. Reducing costs in any capacity is very welcomed, but I wouldn't say it's been a clear tailwind. Funding has been there. If you're well capitalised, good cash flows, then lots of debt opportunities. It's not too much of an issue. But I wouldn't say it's been changing sentiment at all. People have been borrowing for the right reasons, as we were saying, repositioning assets to drive your occupancy, to drive ADR, and hold off competition has probably been the key driver. And fortunately, lower interest rates have helped. It's also important to understand, like the 5-year swap rate has been fluctuating around about 4%. I think it's down to about 3.9 today. So already, if you were looking at hedging, that rate has been available for some time. It was as low as about 3.3 in September. So it hasn't been the driver to changing sentiment and opportunity in the sector. The other aspect with development funding is quite an interesting one. I think most lenders are receptive to funding some form of development. Again, it's having the right proposition, the right operator, and sufficient cash flows. What's been the challenge for operators has been the cost to build. And we've seen lots of clients that are sat on opportunities, so they're effectively land banked. And at the time, it isn't quite right to be looking at a ground-up development. So a lot of what we're seeing is investment into existing stock, where we're adding additions. Yesterday, a couple of us were fortunate enough to be at the Belfry. They've got a huge extension being added onto that, and they're looking at a proposition that they weren't quite tapping into. So this was the leisure market, so they were struggling to attract young families to come for the weekend. So they've got a huge leisure proposition being added. So I think we're seeing a lot of that in the sector. But Coutts, we're very much open for opportunity and development. It's just a case of finding the right project for the right client with the right returns, and it's not easy. It's very difficult.
And to what extent does the sort of the rate at which interest rates fall make a difference?
Sorry, what was that?
To what extent does the rate at which interest...
Well, it eases cash flow, but ultimately we're looking at a look-forward positioning. So we're looking at, say, year 3 of post-completion about what the hotel can fundamentally afford. So we position rates on a today basis and look forward to what that cost is going to be. But it's going to have a contribution to it. But rates, I think this morning was suggesting 4.25 potential reduction to. I think there's 2 camps in the UK. It's either 4% or 3.5% over the next 12 to 18 months. It's not going to make a massive material difference. But what it will do is add sentiment, consumer sentiment. And I think that's the most important thing, is that businesses and consumers have the confidence to spend to help with these projects that we're ideally building out.
Yeah, no, agreed. And of course, interest is just one external factor that impacts, development and investment. So, for others on the panel, Jake, what about other external risks? What about geopolitical turmoil?
So I think in today's environment, it's a question about signal and the noise. And so we have been owning hotels for 25 years now. So if we can go to a macro event, and we can, I'll give you an example of what happened. So 2014, Russian special forces seized Crimea, sanctions. The Russian tourists did not continue going to Helsinki, and there was sort of a big segment for that market. The only thing we can do now then is to find new guests. So that's very straightforward. Okay, so the Russian tourists are not here. We need to find new guests. We should be sort of on the morning call of every hotel every day of the of the year. So if we go to a second macro event, which is, I guess, black swan events, terrorism attacks, these are awful. Often involves human life. And as an owner, then it's all focused on employees. During the attack in Brussels, I was standing next to our then CEO, and he called the area manager. You have one job to do. It's everyone is okay. What about the families? So how can we as an employer be a supportive force to the staff? Because they're in mourning, they could be in shock. And how can we as owner take a responsibility of being an active sort of role in the community that's in shock and in mourning? So, go home, hug your kids, then go back to work. Brand standards, we're not going to care about that now. Go home, take care of your family, and when you're done, when you feel that, you've given the extra hugs, come back and let's continue. And then the third one, which is, I guess, the most critical one, is economic downturn. And that could be a sort of a result of these events that we just mentioned. But we've been through them before. So again, focus on sales, focus on cost, having some type of flexibility on your operating model. So not, I guess, going out and just making people redundant may not be the long-term approach, but you should have sort of that plan, but that should also be in your business plan. What I think is different now is that it can go like that, overnight. And it is the speed, it's flexibility, and this adaptability that we can control. And I think if we can focus on the things we can control, that's a big step towards being more ready for these events. And again, not being sort of impacted by the 20 articles about one statement or 25, analysis about one statement. So.
And then, Philip, we talked a little bit about lobbying government. We've seen, for example, to your point, sort of terrorist attacks, and then there's been lobbies with government, which has resulted in things like Martin's Law coming in, which will then result in more requirements for hospitality businesses. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think the bigger the organisation, the more clout you're going to have with governments. We have obviously a big contributor to UK hospitality, but as a global company, you're going to have senior leaders in multiple jurisdictions. We're headquartered in France, and our CEO Sebastian Bazin, he's almost on presidential speed dial with President Macron. So, what we need is that kind of relationship to be echoed across, our peers in the industry in their respective territories and geographies, continue to contribute to UK hospitality, to support the agenda setting and what are the big issues for, what are the, we're as a brand leader, people look to us to see what we do, not just in crisis terms, in times of crisis, to have the crisis policies, but leading by example, influencing, and effectively getting the message out there. What are the issues, etc. And we're representing thousands and thousands of hotel owners, big groups and smaller groups. And again, the smaller groups don't feel they can have that voice. So therefore, by aligning with the brands, that gives them that opportunity to contribute, but it's also to take the benefits of the policies that the brands put forward. And again, I was going back to the unfortunate terrorism. I remember 7/7 and the crisis management policies kick in straight away, and all of the GMs dial into the crisis calls, and they get the guidance and instructions, and then it's very, very quickly relayed to the rest of the teams and the guests, and again making sure that everybody's safe, well, and okay, and then trying to put some sort of normality back into the operation afterwards when you're dealing with the aftermath of it.
Mm-hmm. I think. Alison, we were talking about the industry being really quite resilient and actually being able to pivot when these big external factors come in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would just only echo what Jake and Phil have said, completely agree. I think this industry has been through so much from, terrorist attacks, COVID, financial crises, et cetera, and just has always been able to pivot, whether it's having to find new guests or a new way of working through the crisis and the aftermath. I think we can all be encouraged by that, by the resilience, which is quite unique to our industry because it's not just, we're looking at it from a real estate perspective, from a lending perspective, from an operating perspective, and it's also, from a personal perspective, from a guest perspective. So it's very dynamic, probably, in relation to other asset classes. So that ability to pivot is more complicated, but we get through it. And I think we know there's going to be more unknowns. And we will deal with it, and we'll get through it.
Great. So turning to demand and consumer confidence, on the one hand, we hear about plateauing demand and declining consumer confidence. I think The Economist this morning may have had a slightly different view, and others have too, about instead increasing consumer spending power, and that's despite what we're seeing in the news. What are you seeing, Alison?
So we really aren't seeing declining consumer confidence. We're very confident, I think, especially in our locations where we're invested that have a strong leisure component. We are very confident. We're spending quite a lot of money across our portfolio, especially for those aspirational destinations. And I think what's been interesting is even during these difficult times for people, less money in their wallet, it feels like the desire to spend on hospitality and travel has gone up the ladder in terms of people are unwilling maybe to give that up, which is encouraging for our industry. And obviously, a lot of our properties are in that sort of, as I say, upscale luxury segment, and that kind of ability to increase prices people have been willing to pay. It's not in every market, but I think across all of our markets now, nominal RevPAR is up versus our previous peak. And I think so what we're seeing is occupancies there and businesses infilling in only those, the off-peak days. And we're just pushing rate in line with that. So we're not seeing plateauing demand. We're confident. We're happy. We're putting our money where our mouth is.
Great. Jake, what about business travel recovery and meetings and events? Is that going to be a strong tailwind?
So I think meeting and events, if we focus on that segment, had a fantastic 2024 with Paris, with European Cup in football, as well as the Eras Tour, Taylor Swift. It's its largest tour ever made. I think it grossed 2 billion and about 10 million visitors. So it's kind of hard to replicate. That combined with Paris, combined with the European Cup, we do think that the segment of event travel will increase. And we're sort of seeing some, I think it also comes down to the competitiveness of a city. Because what we saw in the Eras Tour was that they were so big, the tour, so it sort of had a base in a base camp in one city, and they did 1, 2, 3, 4 concerts, and people flew in. And we were very lucky because we had 4 concerts in Stockholm. And I'm a proud Swiftie, so I was there too. So it's impossible to replicate the magic in the concert as well. So no, but I think the sort of the segment is very interesting to see. People travel and business travel. I think we're not very, very sort of worried about the recovery of the business travel. And we're trying to see if there's any indication between in-office policies and business travel. But I don't have any data on that yet.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I think the events is massive. We've got Oasis coming into the UK this year. The UK is a great market because there's every year that nearly there's a massive sporting event. Depending on 1 year it's football, 1 year it's rugby, 1 year it's cricket. You'll have Taylor Swift last year, you'll have Oasis this year. There's always something going on. The UK is a very attractive place for artists and sports events to happen, and we take full advantage of that, and we need to, because there's plenty of quieter periods of time. And going back to the leisure market, I think people are very keen to have their trips, right? They're the last things they're going to cut back on. They'll might downgrade in their retail, their shopping, their eating out, etc. But they'll still go. They'll go to maybe a lesser priced venue, but they'd be hard pressed to give up their trips away. And you've got 70 million people in a relatively small island, so it paints for a very good domestic market here, and then that's replicated across the continent in Europe as well. So you've got a big European domestic market. I think when you have the open borders in Europe, which we'll see what happens here, you get it's when you can be anywhere in Europe within 2 hours, it's very, very useful. Where we saw the difficulties when travel is restricted, markets like Belgium, for example, how do they, they're very reliant on the international travel, but it's so easy to get there within Europe. And the UK, as I said, it's 70 million people on a relatively small island. So I think we're in for a good future. Business travel, let's see what happens this year. But I think the numbers are still growing despite the record growth over the last 2 years.
So I'm just looking at the clock, and I want to make sure we've got enough time for questions. So one last question from me before we open the floor. So have a think about what you want to ask. So quick question for each of you. What unknown keeps you awake at night?
Unknown.
Alison.
From a personal perspective, America, it's a lot. From a professional perspective, America, honestly, I think from the Archer perspective is, is there going to be any change in U.S. demand inbound to our region? I think that would have a fundamental impact on our business.
Tony.
I try not to let the known knowns keep me awake, let alone the unknowns. So I guess it's sentiment for me. It's consumer sentiment and business sentiment. The market has been so resilient in so many ways. It adapts really well. But I think it's just a combination of many things that can start to eat away, where you look at the cost increases that we've seen, and then it starts to erode sentiment and can bring in further challenges. So I think we've discussed here that depending on your position in the market, depends on how capable you are in riding that challenge. So I think sentiment would probably be the key.
And I think going back to the terrorism, I think that's a bit of a concern, or major concern. You rely so heavily on the authorities and the intelligence community to keep everybody safe and well, and when people are overseas or in hotels, they're not at home. So you've got to, as a brand and a hotel, we've got a big responsibility to keep the guests safe. We see a lot of regional issues become global for unnecessary reasons, and that's a big concern, that it shouldn't kick off in one part of the world because of something going on in another part of the world. And I think you can't control some nutcase who decides to do something, who's a lone wolf, and that's got everybody on high alert, I think.
And Jake's last word.
Unknowns. Sleep like a baby. But mostly, how can you approach uncertain times with a positive approach? And I think that is and the signal and the noise. Don't let the noise get the better of you. And that's my that keeps me up. How to approach everything with a smile. So otherwise unknowns. The alarm bell will wake me up. So
Thank you. Questions over here.
Chris Tarrant, BVA BDLC. I'd just like to ask the panel how they feel about the potential impact, I'm sorry, this isn't sort of negative, about headwinds coming in from government regulation. I mean, obviously we know about the increase in national insurance that's about to kick in as an additional cost, but I'm thinking about other things that potentially are coming, specifically a tourism tax, accommodation tax. It's going to come in Scotland. It looks like it could become widespread. It's another cost on the business. Even potentially regulation coming in on dynamic pricing or certainly surge pricing. I'm just thinking of other things that might be keeping you awake.
Yeah. I'm happy.
Want to take that?
Yeah. So increase in national living wage, it's a key area, and all these other factors are as well. It is a concern, and I think this comes back to my point about consumer and business sentiment, and it's a case of how much erosion do you have to that, and does it impact then on spending and capability. But I think we've seen how, and as the panel's discussed as well, how resilient the sector is to adapt and respond to that. So I think we'll always find a way. I think some of the forecasts that I've been looking at recently shows like a 2 to 3% increase in costs on just the national insurance processing coming in. So it is going to have an impact, but most of our clients are resilient enough to deal with this. They've got strong cash flows. And then it's where cash flows have been tight, it's looking at ways in which they can adapt and minimise the costs that are coming through to the business. But it's challenging times and it's uncertain. But I think overall it's a very positive environment with some challenges to navigate, which the industry has done incredibly well.
Yeah, I mean, just to come back on that point about if there's a tourism tax, I think it really all depends on what the government do with the money, right, or the local authority. I think if you look at Manchester, and they've introduced the city tax in Manchester, it's been really invested in driving the Manchester economy and supporting the events market, which supports the hotels and supports the restaurant. If you can account for where the money's been spent and the hoteliers can see that it's been a good thing, I don't think you can have an issue. The question is if it's just lost in the coffers and it's gone into thin air, then I think that's going to be more of a problem. And then you might say, if the government introduces a national tax, well, then what happens to cities like Manchester who already have a city tax? So I think they need to demonstrate that if they are going to implement the tax, that it's going to be invested back into driving that visitor economy. We have a great thing being it's almost like an exporter without having to do anything, because the people are coming to us, the overseas travellers. So it's a great provider of VAT already. So the government's already getting VAT out of our guests. So they really have to justify what they're going to do with the extra tax that they put on the room rates, because nobody's questioning, are they using the VAT from hotels to reinvest in the business or attracting people to come into the business. So that does have to be highlighted to the government, and we have to see what it's used for.
I mean, from our perspective, we've seen that have, in some cases, a direct impact to our valuations of our hotels. The tourist tax that came in Amsterdam, we've had conversations around that, and it comes down to then, how much of that cost can be passed on. But we've been having conversations with our valuation team, because of course these things have to be factored in ultimately at the end of the day to the value of our properties.
So, as an example from Sweden, where I'm from, we had a couple of years where you had half the social cost on salaries for young people. And I think young people is a great pool for employees. And I give them the minimum wage, but if you can sort of cut that, it actually makes sense to hire young people, and you can train them easily. They're not as affected by the hours. They may not necessarily be as affected by the pay too, because I guess you want party money when you're young, so great job. It's a great pool, also a great pool of people to, get them into the industry, and they may stay. So that was a great initiative, which and also for people that just arrived in Sweden from, I guess, refugees, there's not that much language barrier that it is workable. So that was a great initiative. Obviously, they sort of killed that, and now it's 30%. So I think those kind of measures that help us to hire easily, especially young people, especially at entry level, I think is critical. Especially when the margins, for instance, for restaurants are so low. So it really helps. And there's a certain energy of having a lot of young people that work there that kind of like what they're doing. And if it's 2 or 3 years, it's better than many. So.